On the morning of March 17th, in the year 738 of the Common Era, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Copan in present-day Honduras discovered something that would rewrite our understanding of Mayan civilization. Deep beneath centuries of limestone and volcanic ash, in a chamber sealed since the collapse of the city's great ball court, they found evidence of something unspeakable. Not just skeletal remains, not just weapons or ritual objects, but the deliberate, systematic disposal of at least 15 human bodies, arranged in positions suggesting capture, restraint, and something far worse than a quick death. The official records describe evidence of animal activity, but when independent researchers examined the bones in 1987, they found something the excavation teams had carefully buried in their reports: claw marks, teeth marks, evidence that these individuals hadn't died to the gods in a moment of ceremonial glory. They'd been left for something else, something that fed on them. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple predation. The truth suggested that an entire city's leadership, the priestly class, the war captains, the civic authorities, had orchestrated something that violated even their own understanding of what civilization should permit. This is the story of how a sport became a death trap, and how the winners paid an unimaginable price for victory. Before we uncover the truth about the ball court Howler monkeys and the 738 ad Copan game that cost the losers not just their lives but their dignity, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story from history's darkest chapters. We're releasing 3 new investigations this month that will shake your understanding of ancient civilizations. Drop a comment right now and tell us, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers all across the world. Let's dive in. To understand what happened in Copan on that blood-soaked March morning, we need to step back nearly 1,300 years. The year is 738 AD. The Maya civilization at this moment is approaching the height of its power. We're not talking about distant, primitive cultures fumbling in the darkness. These are people who've built a sophisticated mathematics, astronomical systems more accurate than those of contemporary Europe, networks of trade spanning thousands of miles, and cities that rival anything in the Old World for their complexity and architectural ambition. Copan itself sits in what we now call the Copan River Valley, in the western reaches of the Mayan world. It's a city that would have struck any visitor as a wonder. Massive stone temples rise from a ceremonial center, their facades covered in intricate carvings depicting gods, kings, and the sacred narratives that bound the society together. The city isn't isolated either. It's a crucial trading hub. Obsidian from the highlands, jade from the south, shells from coastal area, all flow through Copan's markets. By 738 AD, this particular city-state is ruled by King Yax Passage, who has reigned for 32 years. But there's tension beneath the surface prosperity. The early 700s represent a crisis period throughout the Mayan world. The great centers of power in the central lowlands are beginning their decline. Massive monuments stop being erected. Populations shift. There are rumors of wars, of competing powers fragmenting what had once seemed like a unified cultural sphere. Copan, as a peripheral city, feels this pressure acutely. To maintain their status, their relevance, their claim to divine sanction, the ruling class knows they must hold power through spectacle, through demonstrations of religious authority, through performances that remind the people that their leaders maintain a sacred covenant with the gods. This is where the ball court comes in. The game the Maya played, a game they called Pocketok, wasn't sport in the way we understand it. It was religious theater, cosmic drama. The ball itself represented the sun. The court represented the underworld. The game wasn't entertainment, it was theology made physical. We know from surviving records and inscriptions that the winners of these games were often ritually killed as sacrifices to the gods, a supreme honor supposedly, an achievement so great it transcended life itself. But by the 700s, something had begun to shift in Copan's interpretation of this ancient tradition. The ruling council, facing pressure from competing city-states and their own people, began to view the ball court games differently. The spectacle needed to be grander, the stakes needed to be higher, the religious power demonstrated needed to be more absolute. What had been an occasional ceremonial event was becoming more frequent. What had been understood as an honor was beginning to feel, to the population, like something else entirely. In the years leading up to 738 AD, records inscribed on Copan's monuments show an unusual frequency of ball court games, 6 major tournaments in 12 years, far more than historical patterns suggest was normal. The inscriptions don't explicitly say who participated, they don't describe the outcomes, But what the archaeological record shows us is that during this same period, there's a marked increase in the capture of prisoners of war. The surrounding regions report increased raids from Copan's warrior class. A neighboring city-state's records, preserved on fragments of ceramic vessels, describe Copan forces sweeping through villages with unusual brutality, not just capturing warriors, which was expected in Mayan warfare, but taking civilians, women, young men, even according to some accounts, adolescents. In the city itself, something else is happening. Public records become fragmented. Some monuments are deliberately defaced. High-ranking officials whose names should appear in ceremonial inscriptions are suddenly absent. The priesthood's official wreck. Ords grow vague about the actual outcomes of games and competitions. This is the moment just before the catastrophe. A city under pressure, led by men who believed they understood how to consolidate power through spectacle, with a population of prisoners who had no idea they were being carefully sorted, trained, and prepared for something that would violate every principle of their own religious understanding. In this atmosphere of anxiety, ambition, and ancient religious certainty, the stage was set for the spring equinox celebrations of 738 AD. What happened during those 3 days of festivals would be so shocking to the surviving inhabitants of Copan that they would spend the next century trying to erase any memory of it. The first incident occurred not in the city proper, but in the surrounding settlements during the dry season of 737 AD. A farmer working in the fields near what modern archaeologists call Structure 10L26 reported unusual activity at night. Sounds. He described it in testimony preserved on a partial ceramic vessel, a remarkable survival, as the voices of the captive ones crying to the gods for mercy. The local authorities told him it was merely festival preparations, that prisoners were always kept in temporary compounds before major games, nothing unusual. But then the farmer added a detail that seems almost innocuous at first. He said the sounds were accompanied by regular rhythmic noises, a kind of pounding, repetitive, mechanical, like something being struck against stone over and over, for hours at a time. When he inquired about this to a guard at one of the enclosures, the guard told him to mind his own affairs and return to his fields. The second incident occurred 2 months later, in the city proper. A merchant's wife, a woman of moderate standing named in surviving records as Kinish Aja's consort, though her own name is frustratingly absent from official records, reported to her husband that she had witnessed something deeply troubling in the sacred precinct. She had been permitted, as wives of high-ranking merchants were, to attend the preparatory ceremonies for the spring tournaments. These ceremonies typically involved ritual bloodletting, fasting, and prayers to the gods, but what she witnessed was different from anything she had seen in 20 years of such ceremonies. The prisoners, dozens of them, were being brought into the inner sanctums. Normally, prisoners would be kept separate, made to understand the honor of their impending transformation. But in these ceremonies, they weren't being ritually prepared. They were being trained, systematically. She watched as priests, men whose names are known to us from other inscriptions, Aja Keen and Aj Pop among them, supervised the prisoners in what appeared to be a coordinated training regimen. The prisoners were made to move in unison, to respond to specific signals, to perform movements that seemed designed to develop muscle memory. She tried to discuss this with her husband, but he forbade further discussion. The rules about sacred matters were clear. Women who spoke too freely about the priest's activities faced serious consequences. The third incident is documented more formally, though the record itself shows signs of deliberate alteration. In the mid-month of the 11th lunar cycle of 737 AD, approximately February by modern calendar, a subordinate official named Yax Chalab was removed from his position overseeing the prisoner compounds. His removal appears in official records as a reassignment for the purposes of greater service to the state, but correspondence preserved in what archaeologists call the Copan archive suggests a different story. In a letter to his superior, whose name has been carefully scratched away, likely deliberately, Yax Chalab writes, "The animals brought to the enclosure near the eastern court have become restless. The prisoners seem to understand something of their purpose. There is fear beyond the normal preparation. This fear spreads. The people of the lower city speak in whispers. If this continues, the religious authority required for the spring demonstrations will be compromised. The people must believe. Fear must remain sacred, not base." What's significant about this letter is what it doesn't say. It doesn't discuss why prisoners would fear purpose beyond the normal sacrifice. It hints at something specific that was understood by the ruling council, something so troubling that even in private correspondence, the writer couldn't fully articulate it. The fourth incident is the most chilling because it comes from a source that was clearly trying to be objective. A young scribe named Kina Khan, who served in an administrative capacity, created what appears to be a calendar of events for the spring equinox celebrations. This calendar, discovered among the archives and partially translated in 1995, includes notations that have confused scholars ever since. Against the date we would calculate as March 3, 738 AD, the scribe wrote, "The Howlers are being brought. The count is now complete." At 17, the priests say it is proper and aligns with the will of the gods. But I have been told that if I speak of what I have heard, of how this is being done, my family will face consequences. I write this for the historical record. Should anyone ever ask why Copan fell, I will say nothing more. That final line, "I will say nothing more," appears multiple times in the remaining pages of the calendar, like a desperate prayer or a warning. The document stops entirely on what we calculate to be March 9, 738 AD. The last entry is a single cryptic phrase. The ball court echoes with sounds that do not come from sport. The gods are hungry, but not in the way we claim to understand. What's particularly haunting is what archaeologists found when they examined the physical calendar itself. It's written on what appears to be deerskin parchment, a valuable and rare material, normally reserved for the most important documents. The fact that a young scribe was using such precious material for what amounts to a coded warning suggests that someone in the administrative apparatus understood something genuinely horrible was happening and was trying to create a record before they died or disappeared. And here's what happens next. We have no other records from Kina Khan. His name never appears in any other surviving documents from Copan. No inscriptions, no other calendars, no administrative mentions. It's as if, after that final entry, he was deliberately removed from history. If this story is giving you chills, please hit that like button right now. Share this with someone in your life who loves dark mysteries. The deeper we go into what happened next, the more disturbing the evidence becomes. We're not done uncovering the truth. Let's discover what happened on those final days of March 738 AD. In 1987, a team led by Dr. William Fash from Harvard's Peabody Museum was conducting routine archaeological work in the area around Copan's main ball court. They were searching for evidence of earlier construction phases. The court had been rebuilt multiple times over centuries, and the team hoped to find inscriptions or artifacts that would help date the various construction stages. What they found instead was a sealed chamber. The chamber wasn't natural. It had been deliberately constructed, likely using temporary wooden supports that had long since rotted away, creating a hollow space beneath the court's western foundation. More importantly, it had been sealed. Massive stone blocks had been fitted together with the kind of precision the Maya were famous for, and then the entire structure had been buried under subsequent construction. Someone had wanted this chamber to be found, eventually, but not immediately. The ceiling suggested that there was awareness that what lay inside needed to remain hidden, at least in the short term. When the team carefully unsealed the chamber, their initial assessment seemed straightforward. It contained human skeletal remains. At least 15, the initial report states, and possibly as many as 23, though fragmentation makes exact determination difficult. The remains were scattered, not arranged in the formal burial positions typical of Mayan elite burials. Many bones bore signs of damage, breaks, fractures, scoring marks. The team's report from 1987, housed in the Harvard archives, describes the findings in clinical terms: multiple skeletal elements consistent with postmortem trauma. Evidence of scavenging activity has obscured precise cause of death determination. Remains appear to span age range from approximately 14 to 45 years. Both male and female individuals represented. But when independent specialists were brought in to examine the bones more carefully, and this didn't happen until the mid-1990s, nearly a decade later, a fact that itself suggests bureaucratic resistance, the picture became far grimmer. Dr. Patricia McKenney and her team at the University of North Carolina conducted a detailed examination of the remains in 1997. What they documented was shocking. The bones bore marks consistent not with typical Mayan sacrifice or ritual killing, but with something altogether different. There were parallel gouges in the long bones of the legs and arms, puncture wounds that matched no weapon used by the Maya. Teeth marks, large teeth marks, the kind that couldn't be explained by the usual post-mortem scavenging from jaguars or pumas. The evidence suggested something systematic. something that had happened to all, or nearly all, of the individuals in the chamber. The marks told a narrative. The individuals had been alive when they sustained most of these injuries. The bone remodeling, the way the body's own healing processes had attempted to close fractures, proved it. This wasn't death followed by animal scavenging. This was injury sustained before death. Repeated injury. Most disturbing was what Dr. McAnany's team found in one of the skulls. A young male, probably no more than 16 or 17 at death. The skull bore marks consistent with massive blunt force trauma, not to the head itself, but to the facial structure. The bones of the cheeks, the jaw, the eye sockets, all bore evidence of being struck repeatedly. The pattern suggested it had been deliberate, systematic, and agonizing. When I say agonizing, I don't mean this as metaphor. The skeletal marks tell us this individual survived the trauma. Survived long enough for the bone to begin healing. Survived, in other words, conscious enough to experience the pain. The damage suggests the striking continued despite this beginning regeneration. The most significant artifact discovered in the chamber wasn't a bone. It was a partial ceramic vessel. An elite quality bowl, clearly produced by a master craftsman, the kind of thing that would normally be buried with the highest-ranking members of society. But this bowl bore an inscription, a label essentially. The inscription was translated by Dr. David Stewart of Utah, Austin, one of the foremost Mayan epigrapher of our time, and it reads as follows: "Here lie the runners of the losing path. They have been given to the Howlers for the transformation of the city. May the gods accept this offering and bring renewal." The runners of the losing path. Given to the Howlers. The term Howlers is significant. It refers directly to howler monkeys, animals native to the region, known for their distinctive haunting vocalizations. Animals that were sometimes used in Mayan ceremonial contexts. But more importantly, animals that were predators, large primates, powerful, dangerous. What authorities were discovering was beginning to form a horrifying picture. These weren't individuals who had lost a ritual ballgame and accepted sacrifice in the way the mythology suggested. These were people who had been tortured, systematically deliberately. The marks on their bones told a story of violence sustained over time, not minutes, not hours perhaps, days. And the marks suggested that this violence hadn't been applied by human hands. The pattern of injuries, the inconsistency, the distribution, it all suggested attack by animals. Large animals. Animals that someone had deliberately withheld food from, that someone had deliberately made aggressive toward human prey, that someone had then released into a sealed space with captive, defenseless people. The discovery raised a question so disturbing that it took the academic community years to even articulate. Had the spring equinox games of 738 AD not been competitions between warriors at all? Had they been performances in which the prizes for victory weren't honor or power, but the right to witness, or perhaps even oversee, the execution of an enemy through animal predation? The implications of Dr. McAnany's findings created a controversy that extended far beyond academic circles. The Honduran government, which has sovereignty over the Copan ruins, faced immediate pressure from multiple directions. International scholars demanded access to all remaining materials from the original excavations. Local communities, many of whose heritage is directly connected to Mayan civilization, expressed deep concern that their ancestors' reputation was being slandered. Officials in Honduras worried about the impact on tourism. Copan is one of the most important archaeological sites in Central America. What followed was a period of intense investigation, resistance, bureaucratic delay, and, in some cases, what many scholars believe was deliberate obfuscation of evidence. In 1998, a comprehensive re-examination of the original 1987 excavation notes was finally authorized. What emerged was startling. The original field team had documented far more detailed observations than appeared in the published report. Sketches showed the chamber arrangement more clearly. One drawing depicted what the original excavators identified as evidence of large animal bones, possibly feline or primate, mixed among human remains, though none were retained for study. Why hadn't these observations made it into the published record? The excavation director of 1987, Dr. Richard Leventhal from UCLA, was asked about the discrepancy in 1999. In a deposition that was kept private but later leaked to scholarly networks, Leventhal explained, "We had concerns about interpretation. The bone preservation, the mixing of species, the state of the remains. We felt we couldn't make definitive statements about causation. We preferred to wait for more advanced analytical techniques. And frankly, we were concerned about the implications for how Mayan civilization would be perceived." These people, the Maya, they've been marginalized, misrepresented for centuries. We didn't want to contribute to further sensationalism. We thought the evidence would be clearer with time. Time, however, only did the picture more troubling. In 2001, Dr. Stephen Whittington at the University of Alabama conducted a specialized analysis of carbon isotopes in the bones. What he found was evidence that the individuals in the chamber had been kept alive for approximately 72 hours after their initial injuries, 72 hours of being alive with broken bones, with wounds sustained by animal predation, with no medical treatment. The trauma would have been extraordinary. The pain would have been beyond anything contemporary witnesses would have witnessed in normal executions or sacrifices. More importantly, Whittington found isotopic evidence suggesting these individuals hadn't been fed during their final days alive. They were systematically deprived of food and water, kept alive but suffering, then released, or placed, with animals that were themselves hungry. The legal and political response was complicated. The Honduran government commissioned its own investigation. Teams from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras worked alongside international scholars. What they found only deepened the mystery and the horror. In the temple complexes near the ball court, sealed storage chambers were identified. When carefully opened, they contained evidence of caged animals. Bones of large primates, identified as howler monkeys, were found along with evidence of captivity. More disturbingly, there were remains of what appeared to be food storage areas, with evidence that these areas had been systematically denied to the animal enclosures during specific periods. Court records and contemporary accounts from neighboring city-states began to receive new attention. A fragmented text from a rival city, which had previously been dismissed as propagandistic, described Copan as having become mad in their worship, offering not the blessed sacrifice of the champion, but the debasement of man to animal level. Such violation of sacred principle has brought darkness upon them. What had previously been read as enemy propaganda now seemed possible. The neighboring city had tried to tell the world what was happening, and nobody had listened. Archaeological evidence shows that the city collapsed rapidly after 738 AD. Monuments stopped being constructed. Inscriptions ceased. The population dispersed. What had been a thriving urban center essentially ceased functioning within a generation. Scholars had previously attributed this to the broader Maya collapse of the 8th and 9th centuries, a widespread phenomenon affecting many cities. But new analysis suggests something more localized happened at Copan. The city didn't decline gradually, it stopped, abruptly. The evidence indicates that the population, once they understood what had occurred in the spring of 738 AD, once they grasped that their leaders had violated not just Mayan ethical principles, but something fundamental to human dignity, they abandoned the city. Deliberately, completely. Inscription fragments that survived had been previously overlooked, contain a phrase that begins to appear repeatedly in the years after 738 AD, Kinich Kalaj, which translates loosely as the sun has turned sick. The city's elite had promised to maintain cosmic order, to maintain the relationship between the human world and the sacred. Instead, they had demonstrated that they were willing to pervert the sacred for power. They had shown that they could twist religious authority into something monstrous. The people left, they didn't return. As for the perpetrators, the priests, the rulers, the officials who orchestrated this, history is less clear. Some inscriptions suggest that certain high-ranking individuals were executed in the years after 738 AD. Other sources, fragmentary and difficult to interpret, suggest voluntary exile. One particularly cryptic inscription refers to a high priest, possibly Ajaquin, though this isn't certain, as having walked into the forest and did not return, seeking the mercy of the gods through isolation. What's most striking is how the surviving records tried to erase the event. Every attempt to reference 738 AD was later scratched away from monuments. References to the spring equinox games were systematically removed from calendars and records. It's as if the remaining leadership, whatever leadership remained, tried to convince themselves and future generations that it had never happened. They nearly succeeded. If not for the sealed chamber beneath the ball court, if not for the persistence of modern archaeologists, if not for the accident of preservation, the truth might have stayed buried forever. The collapse of Copan in the wake of the 738 AD incident reveals something profound about the relationship between religious authority and social cohesion. The city didn't fail because of military conquest, or drought, or disease, or the major stresses that typically explain Mayan city collapses. It failed because the social contract had been shattered. The Maya, like all societies, required their leaders to maintain a sacred authority, a claim that the rulers understood the cosmic order and could maintain the proper relationship between the human world and the divine. This authority is what allowed unequal power structures to persist. The nobility could demand tribute, could demand service, could demand sacrifice, but only because they claimed to understand something the common people didn't. They had access to the sacred. They maintained cosmic order. Once that claim was revealed as false, once the people understood that their leaders were willing to twist the sacred for purposes of power and spectacle, the entire system collapsed. Not gradually, not through overthrow and revolution, but through loss of legitimacy, through abandonment. This pattern remarkably appears in other cultures facing similar crises of authority. The psychologist Eric Hoffer, writing in the 1950s, identified this pattern: communities that abandon a center of power due to loss of faith in leadership authority often don't return for generations, even if material conditions improve or the authority is replaced. The betrayal cuts too deep. The mechanism that allowed social cohesion, the belief in legitimate authority, has been severed. Copan's experience influenced how other Maya city-states understood the exercise of power. In the century following 738 AD, there's a noticeable shift in inscriptional practice. References to animal sacrifice become more careful. The spectacle of sport becomes more controlled. Elite displays of power become more restrained. It's as if the entire civilization learned a lesson from Copan's example. Authority maintained through too obvious perversion of the sacred will collapse rapidly. The event also reveals something about how societies suppress traumatic truths. The contemporary attempts to erase evidence of what happened, the decades of scholarly reluctance to consider the physical evidence seriously, the political pressure to reframe findings, all of this reflects a deep human tendency to deny truths that fundamentally challenge our understanding of a culture or civilization. We see this pattern repeated through history. Societies discover that people they revered behaved monstrously, and instead of integrating this knowledge, they suppress it. They hope it will remain hidden. They pressure scholars and witnesses to remain silent. They create bureaucratic barriers to investigation. It's only through persistent effort, through the work of researchers willing to challenge established narratives, that truth emerges. Similar events echoed through the Maya world in the years that followed. Though not identical, a pattern emerges of elites attempting extreme rituals to consolidate power, followed by rapid population collapse and abandonment. The Tikal region, Karakol, even Chichen Itza in the north, all show evidence of similar crises at various points in the post-classic period. None were quite as deliberately horrific as Copan's transformation of sport into systematic torture and predation, but the underlying dynamic is consistent. The attempt to maintain authority through spectacular violation of sacred norms, followed by the population's rejection of that authority. What the Copan incident reveals about human nature is both dark and, paradoxically, somewhat hopeful. It shows that people will accept remarkable inequalities and restrictions if they believe these are necessary to maintain cosmic or social order, but it also shows that there are limits, that there are boundaries, beyond which people will choose abandonment over continued participation in a system they perceive as fundamentally corrupted. The Copan collapse reminds us that societies are more fragile than they appear. Power rests not on force alone, but on a complex web of legitimacy, belief, and shared understanding. Once that web is sufficiently damaged, once the rulers revealed themselves as willing to pervert the very foundations of the society's spiritual understanding, the whole structure becomes unstable. The ruling class at Copan believed that staging a more spectacular game with higher stakes, with more extreme consequences, would reaffirm their power. Instead, it shattered the faith that made their power possible. The city they ruled didn't fall to conquest or disaster. It fell to the simple, devastating withdrawal of consent. What do you think drove the ruling council of Copan to commit such an act? Was it desperation in the face of declining power? Was it the belief that they could control their population through fear and spectacle? Or was it something darker, a corruption of religious authority so complete that they genuinely believed they were serving the gods? Leave your theories in the comments. We read every comment on this channel, and the best theories often shape our next investigations. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history that challenge everything we think we know about civilization, power, and the depths of human darkness. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an investigation. Share this story with someone who loves dark mysteries and untold history. If you want even deeper dives into historical horror, check out our Patreon. Members get extended analysis, scholarly sources, and early access to scripts. What happened in Copan in 738 AD wasn't just a collapse of a city. It was a collapse of faith, a demonstration that authority maintained through betrayal of its own sacred principles will crumble, whether it takes decades or centuries. See you in the next video. Stay curious. Stay questioning.